Shalom, 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 everybody. What's up, everybody? How y'all doing? Welcome back to Reading with SHILO, man. It's your boy SHILO, man. What's up? It's SHILO, Mr. SHILO. Man, we up in here trying to get it in the next session. In the next session, we are jumping back into On the Real Side, and the history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock, man. We finished up the introduction last night, and we're going to finally dive right into chapter 1. I want to dive right into chapter 1 today. So, man, please come on in. Whenever you come on in, like, comment, subscribe if you're not. Welcome back to all the regular subscribers, and welcome to all the new ones. Put my feet up so we can get to reading, man. So chapter 1 is broken down into parts or sections. We're not going to read long today. We're going to read up to first of all, we're going to see how this internet holds out. Struggle streaming. But I'm going to try to read up to section 3. I'm going to try to read section 1 and section 2, which will be about 1, 2 total pages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 6.5 pages. We'll read about 6.5 pages. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how the internet's working. For sure, we're going to read through section 1. We're going to read through section 1. And depending on the time when we get to section 2, I'll decide whether or not to keep going on section 2. Because section 2 is only like two pages, which I think I can get through pretty quickly. But let's get into it, man. How y'all doing? I hope everybody's having a good day today. Chapter 1 of On the Real Side. Slavery. Don't nobody know my name but me. Slavery. Don't nobody know my name but me. And it has a nice little, I don't say it's nice, but it's an image. Let's see if you see it. There you go. See him getting on that boat right there. Whew. All right, let's go. Let's dive in. We raise the wheat. They give us the corn. We bake the bread. They give us the crust. We sift the meal. They give us the husk. We peel the meat. They give us the skin. And that's the way they take us in. We skims the pot. They give us the liquor. And say, that's good enough for a nigga. Anonymous. Man, I want to go back. No master could be thoroughly comfortable around a sullen slave. And conversely, a master, unless he was utterly humorless, could not overwork or brutally treat a jolly fellow, one who could make him laugh. W.D. Weatherford and Charles S. Johnson. The lines that leads to Mom's Mabley, Nipsey Russell. I wonder if that's what Nipsey Hussle. Nipsey Russell, Bill Cosby, and myself can be traced back to the social satire of slave humor, back even through minstrelsy, through countless attempts to cast off that fantasy. Godfrey Cambridge. Section 1, Part 1. Whew. Hold on, let me get this. Whew. Tight on my head, man. Tight on my head. Section 1. Something peculiar happened on the way to the New World, or at least very shortly afterwards. Somewhere between their departure from West Africa's shores and the early stages of their arrival as human chattel in the Americas, the African captives transported across the Atlantic underwent a subtle but far-reaching and remarkable psychological transformation. It may have begun aboard one of the large canoes that snaked along the winding Gambia or Senegal rivers, stopping periodically to take on more human cargo and then moving away from the dense interior towards Africa's western coast. It could have been that that it first took form in the minds of some of those captives as bond and yoked together in coffles. Their destiny now almost certain, they were transported from a familiarity of tribal life to an anonymous, if to them yet unknown fate. Or it may have occurred later when branded and fettered and, no doubt, still baffled and dismayed, they waited in cattle-like stockades or slave pens at ports such as Britain's Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, or the infamous Maison des Esclaves on Gorée Island off of the coast of Senegal. I know I'm mispronouncing that. G-O-E with a little slash over E. At these and similar sites, tens of millions of Africans were estimated to have lost touch their own soil before being forcibly transported overseas. Or perhaps it happened later during the Middle Passage, the treacherous 3 to 12-week voyage to the New World. As surely terrified by now, they lay shackled and longing either for the fraternity of their homelands, or more realistically, for a merciful death in the dank, cramped bowels of those typically overcrowded slave vessels. It may have even occurred during the brief daily intervals when male captives were joined with females on the ship decks to momentarily glimpse daylight, exercise in order to restore their throttle circulation, and ceremoniously entertain their captors. Or it might have surfaced even later at auction blocks in the West Indies or America, as they were prodded, inspected, and bargained over by prospective buyers, or subsequently when, having been duly purchased and dispatched to their owners, they first began their assigned labor on the farms and plantations, to which most would be confined for the rest of their lives. It is nearly impossible to determine exactly where and when it happened. Few confirmed testaments of the thoughts of these African captives were sought or recorded during the 3.5 centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Indeed, initially, very few slaves could converse or write in the language of their European captives, and it is doubtful, given the express purpose of the endeavor, that their captors would have heeded any such expressions. But during their transformation from Africans to African American slaves, a remarkable, resilient, and inventive manner of behaving and observing both themselves and the external world began to emerge. It would be nurtured and shaped by their interaction with America's social customs and the peculiar institution of slavery, be passed on to the subsequent arrivals, and eventually become a key factor in African Americans' rich and expansive under or subculture. As one historian put it, herded together with others with whom they shared only a common condition of servitude and some degree of cultural overlap, enslaved Africans were compelled to create a new language, a new religion, and a precarious new lifestyle. Later, that Black lifestyle and subculture would become quite probably the most formidable influence on American popular culture. It is in music, of course, that this impact has been most significant. There is also plentiful evidence of the impact on, among other pursuits, dance, sports, colloquial speech, and fashion. But it is the expression manner of African American humor that, second to music, has most influenced mainstream America's popular culture. And although bondage and expression hardly seem to favor the development of a comic tradition, slavery was, ironically, the primary factor in molding the style of content of both primitive and public black humor. From the beginning, it combined cultural elements of traditional African societies with the new language, social institutions, and behavioral patterns of antebellum America. Since then, it has taken a course that is as labyrinthine, ironic, and melodramatic as the work of some of our most darkly inventive Southern Gothic fiction writers. What might have been going through the minds of those African captives when they arrived in the Americas? Some, no doubt, still entertain thoughts of escaping or destroying themselves. The recorded instances of suicides, attempted breakaways, and rebellions attest to the numbers who chose death or the slimmest opportunity for freedom over the safety of serfdom. At the height of the transatlantic trade, epidemics, futile escape attempts, and suicides claimed 6 to 25% of the captives. The British Privy Council, after examining records of slave ships, concluded that, on the average of the African captives who began the Atlantic journey, 12.5% perished. 12.5%. I bet. I wonder if them numbers are skewed, which I'm pretty sure they are. Who would want to put, when money is on the table and you're carrying, where's my stuff? When money is on the table and you're carrying cargo like that, where's my marker? Nobody would like to put the real number, because if the number is too high, it becomes a liability. It's not an asset. You want the numbers to stay low so you have more profit, more income than output. I believe it, as you would say. The British Privy Council, after examining records of slave ships, concluded that the average African captives who began the Atlantic journey, 12.5% perished. Statistics, however, convey little of the reality. The story related by a Southern Carolina black man who had endured the Middle Passage offers a more vivid description. They been packed in there, was then hauled in a car when they shipping them. And every day, them white folks would come in there and F a nigga just twist himself or move. They cut the hide off him with a rawhide whip. And niggas died in the bottom of that ship was then hogs with cholera. What's then hogs with cholera? Them white folks ain't had no mercy. Look like they ain't known what mercy means. They drag them dead niggas out and throw them overboard, and that ain't all. They throwed a heap of live ones where they thought ain't gonna live into the sea. Let me show you. I wish you could see it. You're probably looking at it backwards, but look how it's written. So trying to read that, straight through, like somebody would talk for me. Man, that's a task. That's a task right there. But we're going to keep pushing. In addition, there are numerous reports of insurrections and suicides, sometimes before the slave vessel even left port, according to the captain of a British ship, Hannibal. Negroes are so willful and loath to leave their own country that they have often leaped out of the canoes, boats, and ships into the seas and kept underwater till they were drowned to avoid being taken up and saved by our boats, which pursued them, they having a more dreadful apprehension of Barbados than we have of hell. Other less obstinate Africans undoubtedly initially consoled themselves with the thought that the servitude they faced in America would be similar to what many of them had seen or experienced directly in tribal Africa. Slavery, after all, had existed in Africa since recorded times, although major slave regimes, especially in the West, were relatively few and of limited longevity in the period prior to the arrival of the Christian Europeans. As in Europe, domestic servitude was common in most of the early, more complex African societies, and caravan routes across the Sahara Desert had facilitated Africa's commercial export of slaves to the Mediterranean area even before the emergence of the Roman Empire. After the onset of the transatlantic trade, commercial uses of slaves within the African interior increased, and more African states reacted to the European demand for slaves, resorted to intertribal warfare, and detainment of criminals as a means of acquiring the human chattel that was fast becoming Africa's chief export. Still, slaves or wageless workers in the inland regions of Africa, which were generally isolated from Muslim and eventually European influences, functioned primarily within a comparatively amable system. What is amable? Let's see what that is. Amable. AMIABLE. AMIABLE. Amable. I need to be writing these definitions, man. I mean, I'm writing the words, but I should be writing the definitions. I just don't want it to take away from the reading time. AMI. AMIABLE. Amiable, good-natured, friendly, good-natured and friendly, good-natured or friendly. Which were generally isolated from Muslim and eventually European influences, function primarily within a comparatively good-natured or friendly system. An amiable system. They were seldom or never men without rights or hope of emancipation, and were not outcast in the body politic, writes the British historian Basil Davidson. On the contrary, they were integral members of the community. Household slaves lived with their masters, often as members of the family. They could work themselves free of their obligations. They could marry their masters' daughters. They could become traders, leading men of peace and war, governors, and sometimes even kings. So despite the suicides, insurrections, and barbaric conditions of the Middle Passage, some African captives must have clung to the hope that the treatment awaiting them in the Americas would be less hostile and dehumanizing than what they had experienced since their capture. Those who arrived anticipating a system of bondage, even remotely resembling the comparatively benevolent form that some had experienced in the interior of their homeland, however, were quickly and bitterly disappointed. What they actually found was what Davidson describes as a deep soil of arrogant contempt for African humanity. That contempt was quite possibly the most destructive consequence of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans dispatched to the New World found themselves in a perplexing, if not devastating position. The possibility of successfully escaping and returning to their native land was practically non-existent, and they faced not only a cruel and, for the most part, inflexible system that governed practically every aspect of their lives, but also a community of people who placed little or no value on their humanity. What were they to do? Some, overwhelmed and sensing the futility of any type of resistance, quite probably succumbed to melancholy and despair, and dolefully submitted to the status of mere chattel, becoming, in effect, Uncle Toms, harmless darkies, or Sambos. As the historian Stanley M. Elkins had suggested, these slaves, like many concentration camp victims in the 1940s, accepted their dependent status and internalized the social role demanded of them by their masters. But Sterling Stuckey and numerous other historians have pointed out that many others avoided being imprisoned altogether by the definitions the larger society taught to impose. They neither desperately sought an immediate, violent solution to their condition, nor entirely capitulated psychologically. Instead, they chose deception and subterfuge as the primary survival tactic. The first line of defense for any vanquished or occupied nation, as for any camp or war prisoners, writes James Pope Hennessy, is calculated cunning and deceit. I agree. How am I going to get free? Calculated cunning and deceit. Accordingly, many slaves adopted an obsequious social mask as an essential survival apparatus. Slaves who behaved like Sambos, contends Robert T. Takakai, might not have actually been Sambos, for they might have been playing the role of the loyal and congenial slave in order to survive. Sambo-like behavior may have been not so much a veil to hide inner emotions of rage, but discontent as an effective means of expressing them. In effect, this behavior may have demonstrated resistance to efficiency, discipline, work, and productivity. Where the master perceived laziness, the slave saw refusal to be exploited. The same action held different meanings, depending on whether one was master or slave. To maintain respect for themselves or preserve any remnants of their native culture, subterfuge and lying were absolutely necessary for the Africans brought to America's shores. In addition to the primary task of tilling the fields of cane, cotton, and tobacco plantations and providing domestic and skilled craft services, survival in the New World depended to a great extent upon appeasing slaveholders' demands for the ingratiating demeanor and the eradication of nearly all vestige of Africanism. The response of most blacks to these demands was both rational and effective. As one social historian puts in, over many generations, the slave developed techniques of deception that were, for the white man, virtually impenetrable. Numerous comments from slaveholders or white observers affirm the existence of, as well as the effectiveness of black duplicity. So deceitful as the Negro, one explained that as far as my own experience extends, I could never, in a single instance, decipher his character. We planters could never get at the truth. Another claimed, he is never off guard. He is perfectly skilled at hiding his emotions. His master knows him not. Obviously, the pragmatically adopted policy of putting on master and thereby making deceit part of their lifestyle had negatively long-term consequences for slaves and their descendants, but it did solve some immediate problems presented by bondage. Slaves also used subversion and sabotage, work delay, theft, arson, and destruction of crops as a means of resistance. I like that. I like that. I like it. I like it. Slaves also used subversion and sabotage, work delay, theft, arson, and destruction of crops as a means of resistance. In addition, they often feigned ineptitude and ignorance to achieve their own ends. I'm going to go ahead and mark that as well. Let me see, man. Let me see. We got me some new markers. And I need to come up with a color code. Orange is for definitions and words I don't know. I know that. Blue is for things that are, I think I need to do blue for stuff I need to look up. And green for stuff that is interesting or like a key points, like what I just read. But I'll try to figure it out. The dynamics of this strained interaction with its contrary goals of clandestine motives, a methodically fashioned maze of non-communication and misdirection from the black perspective, are largely responsible for the convoluted interpersonal relationship of black and white Americans to this day. The reaction of one Louisiana physician to slave duplicity and subversiveness not only points out the extent to which slaves duped many of their masters, but in retrospect is also quite humorous. In the mid-19th century, Dr. Samuel Cartwright wrote an essay on diseases peculiar to the Negro, among them dysesthesia and Ethiopia, something like that. Let me spell them. DY. Let me see if it's in here. Maybe it's in a definition. I wish I had my medical book, man. Medical definitions. I need to find that thing. I might need to go find that medical book. All right. Let's see if it's in here. D-Y-S-A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. That's the first word. D-Y, D-Y, D-Y-S. D-Y-S-A-E. No, it's not in here. From the careless moments of the individuals affected with this complaint, they are apt to do much mischief, which appears as if intentional, but is mostly owing to the stupidness of mind and insensibility of the nerves induced by the disease. Thus, they break, waste, and destroy everything they handle, abuse horses and cattle, tear, burn, and rend their own clothes. When driven to labor by the compulsive power of the white man, he performs the task assigned to him in a headlong, careless manner, treading down with his feet or cutting with his hoe the plants he is put to cultivate, breaking the tools he works with, and spoiling everything he touches that can be injured by careless handling. The chicanery and deception established in the initial contacts between black slaves and white masters added a note of comic absurdity and dissemblance that, as one would expect, still surfaces frequently in jokes about interracial confrontations emerging from the African American community. For instance, there is the tale of the black maid who worked in the home near the army camp during World War II. Her employer, displeased with her work, asked, "Do you suppose we'll be able to get more work out of you girls now that they're moved all the colored soldiers away from this camp?" Unruffled, the black woman replies, "I don't know, ma'am. They ain't moved none of the white fellows away." A tale popularized by Dick Gregory in the 60s is even more pointed. A black man enters a southern restaurant and is told, "Sorry, we don't serve colored folks here." His reply, "Fine, I don't eat them. Just bring me a medium rare hamburger." When they adopted subterfuge in the masking of real feelings as a central means of coping with slavery, African Americans set in motion a social and psychological dynamic that has had far-reaching consequences. Most obviously, it established a split in their social behavior, alternate forms of deportment for integrated settings, public and in gatherings among trusted blacks, private, become a relatively enslaved communities. This is reflected with typical folk pointedness in the following slave aphorism: "Got one mind for white folks to see, neither for what I know is me." Got one mind for white folks to see, neither for what I know is me. The deep-seated distrust of white America and codification of a deceptive approach to racial interchanges laid the foundation for a culture that the German historian Bernd Ostendorf aptly described as double-edged, indirect, and ambivalent, one that will not yield meaningful answers to the positivists who is preoccupied with surface phenomena. Along with subterfuge, the irony, contradiction, and distortion that are fundamental to the comic spirit became a central element of American racial relations. But the psychosocial dynamics that shaped African American humor would, until the second half of the 20th century, create an almost unassailable barrier to mainstream America's exposure to it in its authentic form. And that was part one. We got some time. I'm gonna go ahead and read part two. And we're gonna stop. We're gonna stop at part three. We're gonna stop at part three. Right, 2 pages. Two and a half pages of part two, or section two of chapter 1, section 2. Secrecy and subterfuge molded Black American humor's indirect manner and also helped slaves perpetuate the African custom that gave that humor a distinctive cast. As Sterling Stuckey points out, slave deception aggressively worked against whites acquiring knowledge of slave culture that might have been used to attempt to eradicate that culture. As incredible as it may seem from the vantage point of the 1990s, for more than 300 years after the arrival of African slaves in America, nearly all historians and sociologists insisted that African Americans had no culture of their own. Early in the 20th century, the renowned Black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois apparently became the first scholar to suggest that the behavior of Black Americans was significantly influenced by African culture. Subsequently, Carter G. Woodson, founder of the Journal of Negro History, supported those claims, but it was not until Melvin J. Herskovits' 1941 book, The Myth of the Negro Past, in which he reaffirmed the idea of African cultural retentions advanced by Du Bois and Woodson, that the issue was seriously debated in academic circles. Prior to Herskovits, it was presumed that the Middle Passage, restrictive Black codes outlawing particularly all African customs except dancing and singing, which were thought to facilitate productivity, and the impact of Western society's more advanced culture had magically eradicated all vestiges of African beliefs, or much less frequently, in the complete reversal, it was argued that Blacks' lowly position in America was the consequence of having brought all of their barbaric customs across the Atlantic. In fact, according to the informed opinion of many historians, Africa, mirroring fictional depictions of in Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan novels, was simply a primitive, pagan civilization with little or no culture worth considering. One can easily disregard the pro-slavery propaganda of such writers as George Fitzhugh, Dr. John H. Van Every, and Dr. Josiah C. Knott, whose unsubstantiated and skewed views were instrumental in establishing many of the popular myths about Africa and African Americans during the 19th century. But even the most reputable scholars presented a more or less homogeneous estimate of African savagery and the death of African American culture. In 1919, for instance, Robert E. Park, the esteemed and influential co-founder of the University of Chicago School of Sociology, commented, "In fact, there is every reason to believe, it seems to me, that the Negro, when he landed in the United States, left behind almost everything but his dark complexion and his temperament. It is very difficult to find in the South today anything that can be traced directly back to Africa. Later, Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish social scientist commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation in 1937 to prepare a study on the Negro problem and American civilization, while admitting that perhaps there was a measure of truth in some of Hershowitz's claims, proceeded to dismiss nearly all of them. In his much acclaimed An American Dilemma, Myrdal argued that, in particular, all of its divergences, American Negro culture is not something independent of general American culture. It is distorted development or a pathological condition of the general American culture. According to Myrdal, in his cultural traits, the Negro is akin to other Americans. True, there has developed recently a glorification of things African, especially in music and art. But this is a reaction to discrimination from white people on the one hand, and the result of encouragement from white people on the other hand. In a different context, Myrdal wrote that Negro thinking is almost completely determined by white opinion, negatively and positively. It seldomly moves outside the orbit fixed by the whites' conceptions about the Negro and about caste. This vicious cycle of caste operates upon the finest brains in the Negro people and gives even to the writings of the Du Bois a queer touch of unreality as soon as he leaves his problem, which is the American Negro problem, and makes a frustrating effort to view it in a wider setting as an ordinary American and as a human being. Although Myrdal's book is a virtual gold mine of information, I might have to look that up. I might have to go find Myrdal's book. In as much acclaim, An American Dilemma. Let me mark it so I can go back and look it up. Gunnar Myrdal, he wrote An American Dilemma. An American Dilemma. I have to look that up. Although Myrdal's book is a virtual goldmine of information, the most exhaustive study of Black America ever undertaken, it is also littered throughout with such latent nuggets of misinterpretation. Of course, Myrdal was not the only scholar to take exception to Hershowitz's. How can I help you, sir? Well, go in the room where the AC is on it, son. I'm almost done. I have one more page left to read, all right? Myrdal was not the only scholar to take exception to Hershowitz's revised appraisal of the survival of African culture among Blacks in America. Those who initially objected most vociferously included a number of prominent Black intellectuals. One of the most adamant and vocal was the distinguished sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, author of numerous texts, including the prize-winning study The Negro Family in the United States in 1939. Frazier's chief objection concerned the influence of African customs on the structure of Black American family and church life, but he had previously written rather emphatically that the most conspicuous thing about the Negroes is his lack of culture. The sociologist and civil rights leader Charles S. Johnson, who was president of Fisk University from 1946 to 1956, and whom Langston Hughes and Arna Bontemps considers one of the nursemaids of the Harlem Renaissance, was another outspoken critic. Johnson, who had studied with Robert E. Parks at the University of Chicago, constantly argued that Black behavior was the result of Blacks accommodating adjustment to slavery rather than any residual African culture traits. How could those early 20th century intellectuals and even some modern day scholars suggest that African slaves' memory of their culture had simply disappeared along with nearly all vestiges of that culture after the transatlantic journey? The primary reason, asserts Bert Ostendorf, is quite clearly politics. Other reasons, though they seem to hinge on questions of methods or scholarly accuracy, are equally political. For example, Alien Locke, editor of the highly acclaimed The New Negro in 1925, contended that if whites acknowledged a strong African heritage, they might conclude that blacks were unassimilable. And Fraser feared that if whites believed that the Negro's social behavior was rooted in African culture, they would lose whatever guilt they had from keeping the Negro down. Ostendorf also noted pro-slavery propagandist justification of slavery by creation of the Sambo myth, which fixed the stereotype of the inferior black incapable of being assimilated into whites' higher culture. Then the the integrationist aims of many blacks as well as of many whites sympathetic to the black cause and blacks reluctance to the associated with an African culture tradition. Oh shit. My bad. I'm running these words. Let me go back. Ostendorf also noted pro-slavery propagandist justification of slavery by creation of the Sambo myth, which fixed the stereotype of the inferior black incapable of being assimilated into whites' higher culture. The integrationist aims of many blacks, as well as of many whites sympathetic to black cause, and blacks' reluctance to be associated with the African culture tradition that had been so insistently portrayed as primitive and inferior. Yet, it is now apparent that blacks preserved many of their African beliefs and practices after arriving in America. Among them are religious and burial practices, family structure, interpersonal social behavior, motor habits, walking, speaking, laughing, sitting posture, etc., music, rhythmic response, folklore, and rhetoric or language. Although there is still some debate over social institutions such as family and church, there are few who seriously or convincingly deny the impact of African culture or artistic and social expression, areas that largely shape our humorous expressions. More and more, contemporary scholars are heeding the venerable Ashanti proverb, ancient things remain in the ears. I guess that's where the song and dance came in. Lorenzo Turner's much acclaimed book Africanism in the Gullah Dialect, 1949, for instance, demonstrate that the accents of blacks living in the coastal sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia were derived from Africa and not, as we once widely held, from archaic dialects of 16th century England. And Sterling Stuckey's Slave Culture, Nationalist Theory, and the Foundation of Black America in 1987 not only demonstrates specific examples of African culture surviving in religion, singing, dancing, and the use of musical instruments, but suggests that circle dances and shouts, a common practice in many West African tribes, allowed Africans of disparate origins and cultural backgrounds to participate in a common ritual that eventually facilitated the integration of various African tribal customs and the formation of a distinct African American subculture. According to Stuckey, this cultural convergence provides the key to understanding the means by which they achieved oneness in America. In all the prohibitory dance, along with music and singing, was also an activity that initially allowed slaves to communicate furtively with one another, forbidden directly to voice any protest about their condition or even to speak in their native languages. Slaves used music and dance not only to establish a symbolic or kinesthetic. Let's see what that is. KINESTHETIC. 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 Let's see if it's in here. Yes, sir. I hear you. What's up? Yes, sir. I'm almost done. I got one more page left. I got a half a page left. Yes, sir. Y'all can take a break now. Yes, sir. Y'all can take a break. KIN. That's KIT. KINES. It's not in this one. Let's look at the other one. Yes, sir, DJs. Good job. What letter is that? O for what? That's good. Yes, sir. KINESTHETIC. Kinesthetic. I know I'm mispronouncing it. Get out of here, boy. Get out of here. Get your sweaty butt out of here. You are sweaty. Get out of here. You'll get ready to take a shower. Get out of here. Move. Okay, kinesthesia or kinesthetic. There we go. Kinesthetic. A sense of mediated by end organs located in muscles, tendons. Oh, like kinesiology or kinesiology. I think I have something. Yeah, so you can take a break. You cut it off. Kinesiology. Kinesthesia. Kinesthetic. Sensory expression derived from the senses. That sounds better. Sensory expression derived from the senses. Sensory expression derived from the senses. Forbidden directly to voice any protest about their condition or even to speak in their native languages, slaves used music and dancing not only to establish a symbolic or sensory expression derived from the senses, derived from this sense connection or kinesthetic connection to the homeland and one another, but also to conveying feelings and thoughts to other slaves. As Stuckey and others have noted, Chanting, foot stomping, hand clapping, and dance were central elements in the various rituals and religious ceremonies of most of the Western African tribes from which the slaves had been abducted. Moreover, in these tribes, dance was a highly esteemed art and means of communicating. Robert Ferris Thomas quotes, an elderly means, that's fine. An elderly, made me lose my place, boy. Robert Ferris Thompson quotes, an elderly member of a Cameroon Nigbo community who, after observing one dancer, commented, I like him because he uses the conversation with his body. Even an old man can dance conversation. The argument Charles Keel makes in his Urban Blues in 1966 about music applies to humor and Black culture in general. The entertainment component of Negro culture is significant in at least four basic respects. First, it is the one area in Negro life that was clearly not stripped away or obliterated by slavery. Second, unlike the immigrant cultural traditions, which have been either diluted or dissolved almost completely in the American context, this important cultural legacy linking American Negroes to Africa has not only survived, but has thrived on adversity and grown stronger through the years. Third, it is now a full-fledged tradition in its own right. One does not have to be a specialist in African culture, ever on the alert for Africanism, or a sociologist of race relations studiously attuned to the marks of oppression in order to understand a performance by B.B. King, a sermon by the Reverend C.L. Franklin, a Moms Mabley comedy routine, or a John Coltrane saxophone solo. Familiarity, preferably intimate with contemporary Negro culture, and some sensitive to the peculiar form of expression in question, music, rhetoric, choreography, choreograph, analytic prerequisites. Finally, and the most important, the entertainers are masters of sound, movement, timing, the spoken word. One can therefore find in their performances the essential and defining features, the core, in fact, of Negro culture as a whole. And that is the end of part 1 and part 2 of chapter 1 of On the Real Side. A history of African American comedy from slavery. Nope, wait, I'm coming in there. Wait, might as well cut it off. Go ahead, tell DJ cut his off too. African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. Where is my stuff? Man, we are chopping down at this big monster, man, one step at a time. One step at a time. We have finally reached chapter 1. I am definitely glad I'm reading better in chapter 1, even though I stumbled over a lot of words, but I'm reading better in chapter 1 than I did the introduction. It was a lot of stuff in the introduction, man. That was knocking me upside the head. But we will continue to push on, man. It's a big book, man. It's a big book. It's a big one. But I like that. I like that. I'm doing damn good. We're going to keep pushing, though. We're going to keep pushing and seeing if there's anything that we can learn and grow from in this book by Mr. Mel Watkins. One step at a time, one day at a time. Man, I might start doing 2 a days. As long as the internet hold up, I'll probably get back to doing 2 a days. But right now, if I do 2 a days, my second video or my second live is going to be pretty late at night, probably about 11 o'clock after my boys go to sleep and after I sit down and recoup myself. But We'll see, depending on what's going on. By 11, I'll read for about an hour. And we'll try to keep pushing one page at a time until we get the book all the way done and through. Let me see. So we'll come back, Lord willing. Lord spell life. Ooh, shit. Hold on. I know I missed some. Yeah, okay. That's better. That looks better. Lord spell life. I'll come back later on, or the next session will be part 3 of chapter 1. Part 3 or section 3 of chapter 1. Let me see. 3, 4. Ooh-wee. Yeah, we'll probably read just section 3 by itself and then section 4 by itself. Because section 4 is kind of lengthy. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how I feel as we're reading. But no matter how it is, like I said, we'll keep pushing. One page at a time. One page at a time. One day at a time. So thank you, everybody who is, in here, who has watched. Like, comment, leave a comment. Let me know what you think about the reading. Let me know if it's something that you found interesting in what you heard. And let's keep growing together, man. Let's keep learning and growing together. But until next time, man, shalom, SHILO out. I hope that y'all have a wonderful day, and keep on pushing.